I'm joined by the co-host of Pod Save America and Pod Save the World, Tommy Vietor. Thanks for coming back on.
It's great to be back. Good to see you.
You too. So let's start with the situation unfolding in Afghanistan. When Kabul fell to the Taliban, the media was practically tripping over itself to declare Biden's performance a failure. So do you think that was justified?
I think that there were a lot of ways to avoid this outcome, and all of them are easy to identify and describe in hindsight. It's a lot harder in the moment. And so I think whenever you have a situation where, you have an organization like the Taliban that was literally an enemy 5 minutes ago, going through the capital city where there's potentially 5,000, 10,000, we don't even know how many thousand Americans, where there's all these translators who work to the US haven't gotten out yet. I think it's fair and appropriate to criticize that evacuation effort or the lack thereof in that moment. I worry that that might obscure the broader need to end this war and the context, which is that continue the U.S. staying in Afghanistan for another year, 2 years, 5 years would undoubtedly mean thousands more Afghan people dying, the U.S. taking casualties, billions of dollars spent. And so I think that's a broader context that needs to be brought into these debates.
Well, building on that, a lot of the criticism here centers around the evacuation itself. And look, I know it's easy to criticize in hindsight, but is there something that Biden should or could have done differently that was to be expected?
Yeah, and well, so yes, good question. And I think the context is President Trump negotiated a U.S. exit from Afghanistan in February of 2020. President Biden came in and essentially pushed the date of the withdrawal out, but kept the other terms. And I think what had to happen in that period between when President Trump negotiated the U.S. departure from Afghanistan and today is the U.S. government as a whole needed to drastically ramp up the processing of special immigrant visas. These are the visas for people in Afghanistan and Iraq who were interpreters for the U.S. military and helped us, and the so-called P2 visas, other visas for people that worked with USAID or media organizations, et cetera. Now, the problem there is Donald Trump didn't want refugees. He didn't want immigrants. There's lots of reporting about how Stephen Miller would try to, basically squash those programs or kill them with bureaucracy. And that was the challenge Biden faced. In fact, like the SIV visa program was created in 2008, and the delays in processing those visas have been well known for years, to the point where there was a lawsuit against the Trump administration. So I think the fair criticism of the Biden administration is to say, look, I know the intel community told you that we had 6 to 12 months before Kabul fell, but if there was any risk of there being significantly less time, you needed to figure out a way to either speed up visa processing, or you need to push that departure date further out, maybe into the winter after the fighting season ends. Because in Afghanistan, there's literally something called the fighting season, which is basically when it's warm enough for people to move around the country and fight. And maybe if the departure had been in February, then the Taliban wouldn't have been able to roll across the country. There's a lot more broader context about the way, the U.S. military trained the Afghan security forces over 2 decades. That's part of this, but these are sort of like the options in the reality that was laid at Biden's feet when he got there.
Okay, going back to the media coverage for a moment, we're effectively seeing Biden shoulder all of the blame for this, and yet someone like George W. Bush is basically being absolved of any and all responsibility, even despite the fact that he got us into this situation in the first place. So what's your response to the fact that a good amount of the Afghanistan coverage is from Bush administration officials who themselves are complicit in getting us into this war, and how their commentary is really driving the coverage here?
I woke up this morning and I saw a tweet of an op-ed from Henry Kissinger criticizing the end of the Afghan war, and I almost threw my phone through a wall. I think it's important to separate out the criticisms of the withdrawal over the last week and some of the chaos we've seen with a conversation about the broader war effort and the value of basically massive nation building efforts like we saw in Afghanistan or Vietnam. I think the lesson has to be that we never should have started a war like the war in Iraq, that we never should have tried to undertake this massive nation building enterprise in Afghanistan. And I say that as someone who worked for Barack Obama, who sent tens of thousands of more troops to Afghanistan in an effort to do this counterinsurgency plan, to do nation building. And in hindsight, I believe that was a mistake. I think that the 2009 and 2010 troop surge got us back to the status quo, and that we never should have done it, and that we should have shifted the mission in that moment to just a counterterrorism effort. Now, ultimately, we got bin Laden. The U.S. government, the U.S. military, the CIA were able to degrade Al Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan, which that threat had grown significantly from essentially 2002 when the war started, or 2001 when the war started, until 2009. But this nation building effort, this massive troop buildup, was a mistake, and we need to admit that and not ever do that again.
Yeah, I mean, I think something missing in all of our endeavors is taking into account what the people of these countries actually want. Like, we go in there to like bestow Western democracy onto the people of Afghanistan, but whether they even wanted that was never taken into account.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the United States went to Afghanistan to like get bin Laden, to get Al Qaeda, and then very quickly this mission shifted under the Bush administration to nation building, where we tried to build them a modern military, where we tried to build a modern government, where we helped them build a constitution. And, ultimately, like, you can't force these solutions onto a people, into a place. It just didn't work. It didn't fit.
Yeah.
And, what's hard, I think, for me about some of the discussion you're seeing right now is some of the same like Bush era critics that you mentioned earlier are saying, you know what, if the U.S. had just kept a couple thousand troops, stayed for a few more years, things would have been fine. We would have kept the lid on. They never mentioned the fact that the Afghan security forces, the army and the police, were taking thousands of casualties each year. Their casualties had drastically ramped up as ours ramped down. And the civilians were often living in hell. They were living in the midst of a civil war. And like, that context matters. The options were, as what we're seeing now, life under the Taliban, or the option was life in a permanent war. And I think both have downsides, and we have to be honest about both of those downsides.
Even if we were able to stave off the Taliban by keeping troops there, for what? So then we can end up 25 years in and it still be a house of cards like it was 20 years in, to fall immediately upon deciding to leave,
There were some really foundational problems with the entire undertaking. One of them was the fact that the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan is pretty porous, and the Taliban could just escape over the border and have a safe haven in Pakistan. And the US government never found a way to solve that problem. The other was corruption, and the fact that the Afghan government was not viewed as legitimate by a large subset of the population. They viewed them as people who were stealing from them. They were not providing services. They did not feel secure in a lot of places and villages because of the anti-Taliban efforts. And so you're right. Like, there's something called the sunk cost fallacy that governments often make, which is basically, we put so much time and effort and money into this thing, we can't stop now. And then you end up putting more, time and money and effort into a failed enterprise. Yeah.
Well, in your opinion, what will the legacy of this 20-year war be? And will it be the narrative of a botched evacuation by Biden?
What I hope the lesson is, and the takeaway is that the U.S. military can do discrete things incredibly well. They can find bad guys, they can kill them, they can take out terrorists. The Central Intelligence Agency, the NSA, the intel folks can track them and find people like bin Laden or ISIS leaders. The U.S. military cannot solve political problems. They cannot build a government. They cannot, help build a Western-style military for a country where a lot of the people they're trying to recruit to the army or the police never had a high school education. And what I think we need to come away understanding is we have to get past the hubris that came after 9/11. We have to get past allowing ourselves to be constantly led by fear of terrorist organizations, and just be a little more rational about the limits of American power and the actual risks that we face in the world. Because listen, there may be Al Qaeda or ISIS or other bad guys in Afghanistan in the future, but if you look at what's killing Americans in America right now, it's COVID-19. And we need to do a hell of a lot more to prevent the next pandemic, in my opinion, than we do to manage Al Qaeda in Afghanistan. I think we have the infrastructure and agencies in place to monitor and keep an eye on terrorist threats in ways we did not have in 2001.
Fox and Republicans are slamming Biden for not being able to get people out, and yet at the same time, Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham are already warning about the impacts of having gotten these people out. They called the impending arrival of Afghan refugees an invasion. How do you reconcile these right-wing talking points where, in the same breath, they're condemning the administration for both not being able to get these people out, and then what will happen now that we are getting them out?
Yeah, look, it's racist, it's incoherent, and it's something we need to watch. I mean, I think this is going to be the next big fight. You are going to see people like Tucker Carlson or Laura Ingraham or JD Vance, the asshole running for Senate in Ohio, who once criticized Donald Trump for being an Islamophobe, for being anti-immigrant, and now is parroting his talking points because he thinks it'll help him win a primary in Ohio. This is the next big fight. And I think Democrats need to make the case that these are men and women who stood side by side with the United States in Afghanistan, interpreters who were on the battlefield with US soldiers. These are people who bled for the United States, who gave far more than most of us back home did. And we should welcome them to the United States, and we should help them build a life. And ultimately, their presence in this country will be good for America in the same way that Vietnamese immigrants after the Vietnam War have built entire communities across America who have given back so much to this country. And so this is something I think Democrats need to take head on and really fight for bringing people to the U.S. and helping them build a life.
Yeah, and I think that what you said kind of lends itself more broadly to the idea of not shying away from these culture wars, but
Right.
fighting them and winning them, because so
Right.
many of these culture war topics are winnable. They're topics that the vast majority of Americans actually agree with Democrats on, and yet
Yeah.
we shy away from them because, God forbid, we push back against something that Tucker Carlson or Sean Hannity said on Fox Primetime.
76% of Republicans in the CBS poll think that we should welcome Afghan interpreters to the
Yeah,
U.S. You know,
yeah.
this is a winnable fight. We just cannot let them demagogue it. We cannot make Republicans make this all about vetting or individual fears of terrorism. This is about values. This is about
What's
like our word.
What's especially ironic about this too is almost the same day that they were fear-mongering about the possibility of Afghans coming here and being terrorists, even though these people were, on the battlefield with our troops for 2 decades, we had a right-wing domestic terrorist park his car in front of the U.S. Capitol and threaten to blow up 2.5 city blocks, and that went away, like a fart in the wind.
Yeah.
An actual terrorist, and yet it was way more important to fearmonger that a brown person may be a terrorist at some point in the future, as opposed to the fact that we had one sitting right here in his car, calling on Joe Biden to resign.
It's a really important point. I think we've seen this over and over and over again in the United States, from Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, to the January 6th, terrorists at the Capitol. The right wing is more than happy to defend, spin, explain away right-wing terrorism as somehow about freedom or liberty or some made-up nonsense, and they are thrilled to demagogue threats from people who are brown or black or Muslim. And it is cynical and hypocritical, and we need to call them out on it.
Well, I think that's a good segue into Tucker Carlson specifically. A couple weeks ago, he went to Hungary to kind of go on this image rehab tour with Viktor Orban. What do we need to know about Viktor Orban to give some context to that visit?
Sure. So a great quote about Viktor Orban came from Steve Bannon, Trump's former Svengali, who once called Orban Trump before Trump. He is someone who believes in a brand of white Christian nationalism. He is incredibly hostile to immigrants. He is openly racist. He gave a speech in 2018, I believe, where he said, we do not want to be diverse. We do not want our own color, traditions, and national culture to be mixed with those of others. He built a border fence in 2015 during the big flow of refugees across Europe in an effort to keep them out. And he has demagogued these issues to gain political control and to reshape the Constitution, to take control of the media, and really undermine the electoral process in Hungary, to really take it from a democracy to something closer to autocracy. So he is someone we should really worry about.
Super weird. I can't imagine why Tucker Carlson would have any vested interest in helping that guy.
Right.
Can't figure out the link there.
I know. Yeah, same. And I don't know this for sure, but I think he probably got a big old paycheck to give a speech there as well. So, good old Tucker. He's always in it for himself too.
So what is the benefit for both Viktor and Tucker individually for working with each other? You don't usually see the link between the U.S. and Hungary and what the benefit would be between propping up people in these two countries.
It's a really good question. I mean, we have seen this sort of alliance of right-wing nationalist figures across different countries. Steve Bannon tried to create an institute, I believe, somewhere in Italy, where he would bring all these people together. Like, we really need that. And so I think for Tucker, he wants to point to Orban and say, look, he built a border fence. He locked down on the media. He was anti-immigrant. Look how great it's turned out for him. I would argue that's not really the case. And then for Orban, I mean, Orban wants legitimacy in the United States. Trump met with him in 2019 in the Oval Office. That was his first Oval Office visit since 1998, when he was viewed very different by the international community. Orban wants international legitimacy and to be welcomed into the global community and not to be viewed as a pariah, which is what I think he should be viewed as.
Yeah, and Tucker handed that right to him on a silver platter.
On a silver platter.
What does it say about the American right that Republicans are now carrying water for people like Viktor Orban, for these far-right nationalist figures?
I think it shows that at the end of the day, they are willing to give up democracy if it allows them to be, a white state, a white Christian ethno state. I mean, that is the priority for them. It's keeping out brown people. It's keeping out Muslims. The parliament in Hungary passed a law banning gay people from being in high school educational materials or shows for kids under 18. I mean, they are thrilled to use bigotry as a political tool, even if it makes a country undemocratic. And I think that's the kind of effort we've seen since the election and Trump's efforts to undermine it, and that's something we need to be very mindful of.
Yeah, I do want to finish up with this, and this is a bit of a non sequitur, but I want to get your thoughts on it anyway. What do you think about the idea that independent redistricting commissions, which are largely found in blue states anyway, are basically acting as a means of unilateral disarmament right now by Democrats?
Listen, I'm going to go ahead and just be a giant fucking hypocrite. I think that if Republicans are going to redistrict us out of all these seats, we need to fight fire with fire. And so I was really excited to see the new governor of New York suggest that she might be willing to ditch some of these nonpartisan redistricting efforts and implement a partisan gerrymander, because we just can't allow the House of Representatives to be taken away from the Democratic Party through redistricting and not push back. I don't want to win a purity test. I want to win a political fight that ultimately gives people voting rights. I think that's what matters.
And I think at the end of the day, all you have to say if Republicans push back against it is make it illegal. Pass legislation banning partisan gerrymandering. The
Totally.
Ball is in your court.
100%. Yes. I am 100% in favor of nationwide nonpartisan redistricting. Let's do it. We just can't do it state by state, where you have, states like Ohio or North Carolina or Texas, where, the Democratic Party has only a couple congressional seats, but won 49% of the vote or 45% of the vote. It's not fair. It's not how a democracy should work.
Well, Tommy, thank you so much for coming back to talk. And again, for anybody listening, check out Pod Save America and Pod Save the World.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.